First of all, I want to say thanks for coming on. I was fascinated to hear about this book, but before we even get into the book, what I didn't know, and I did a little research on you, you've been a medical doctor, like an OBGYN for about almost, is it 40 years? Is it close to getting, is it over 40 or close to 40?
Oh, probably about 40 years. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that was amazing to me. And for those out there who don't know, it's not like you were just practicing medicine. You're an expert in your field. Let's put it that way. You've had like 200 peer reviewed pieces in medical journals, and you've written chapters and books. And it was fascinating how you went from being an expert in that field to transitioning over to being an author. And you've written some medical thrillers and a couple other things. Did you want to talk about that? Like, what was your decision to go from being a sought after OBGYN to writing books?
Well, I knew high school and college, you're just a lunkhead, you don't know what you really are interested in or want to do. But when I started medical school, I started reading a bit more. There were a couple of specific books that kind of inspired me, and I kindled an interest in writing.
Okay.
Not everybody might remember this book, but there was a famous book called House of God, written by Samuel Shem, about training medical residency. Hilarious and heartbreaking story,
Uh,
and I encourage anybody to pick it up if they ever see it. But I read that while I was in medical school, and also I read The Lords of Discipline by Pat Conroy, and I was blown away by that book. It was a local book. Pat Conroy was from this area, and that book is about the integration of the Citadel. It's a novel, but
okay.
it's about integration of the Citadel Military Academy back in the 60s.
Okay.
So I always wanted to write, and I had stories in my head. Literally, the first book that I wrote, which is called Occam's Razor, was based on an event that happened to me when I was a resident back in the early 80s, and it just stuck in my head, and I didn't write the book for 30 years, but the story was there.
Yeah.
But then, once you get into, you do your training, which is time consuming, and then you start your practice, and it just eats up all your time and your family, our children, you have to kind of I kept on reading, but I didn't really have the opportunity to write, but I
Sure.
always knew I wanted to. And then finally, the last of the children go off to college, and the clinical part of my practice starts to cut back some. I ended up getting a little more into some research and teaching on the faculty at the Medical University of South Carolina. So I found that I had the time. So
Okay.
that's when I started writing. I loved it. I didn't know if I was any good at it. A lot of people told me I wasn't.
What do they know?
Yeah, well, no, they knew a lot.
Oh,
A lot of the things that those early editors and literary agents and people like that would tell me. I always thought my stories. I always thought I could write for, like you said, in my academic life, I have to write a lot.
sure.
So I always thought I could write. I just didn't know if my stories were any good. I did get a postcard back from a literary agent one time that said, "This story is pretty good, but you're a terrible writer." And he or she was right. I know my books have improved as I've written more of them.
Yeah.
So anyway, I've loved my career as a OBGYN, delivered thousands and thousands of babies, and but it's a young man's game or a young
Sure.
woman's game, and I've backed away from some of the clinical aspects of it. My interest was always interesting. I haven't written any books that tap on this, but my interest has always been multiple gestations,
Okay.
and that's probably what I'm best known for. I wrote a book with a friend of mine called "What to Expect When You're Expecting Twins, Triplets, or Quads." That probably is the most significant thing I've ever done in my career. It sold 100,000 copies and it continues to sell. It's a bestseller,
Yeah.
and everywhere I go, whenever I do a book event of any kind, some family always comes up with twins and says they read my book, and that's always very gratifying.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, that doesn't happen a lot. Like, there's not a whole lot of multiple gestations. So to have a resource out there, I'm sure they were very, very grateful that you took the time to put all that information together in one place. I'm sure that they got little bits here and there, but to have a compendium on it was probably a lifesaver for a lot of those families.
Yeah. I, I've noticed that in the last several years, for all my life, if anybody ever asked me what I did, I told them I'm an OBGYN. And now when people ask me what do I do, the first thing that pops, it's not always what I say, but the first thing that pops into my head is that I'm a novelist.
Yeah.
So it's been a really interesting transition for me. All my partners and my friends are all very supportive of it, and so it feels good.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, your new book, it's called Boys, and it is a historical fiction, but it's based off it's based off your family. So go into that. I don't want to step on it. I'd like for you to explain it, but I thought it was a fascinating way that you came up with this idea. Like it was not something that someone would expect. Please go into how that you came up with the idea and the background and kind of what the book is about.
Well, it is heavily fictionalized, but it is based on my own family history. My father was a World War II veteran. And like a lot of World War II veterans, he wasn't a talker. He didn't talk a lot about the war. I was not smart enough to ask him about the war when I was young. Always wished I had asked him more.
Yeah.
But he had grown up in western North Carolina in a very small town called Leakesville, where his father ran the local dairy and was also a pastor of a primitive Baptist church that they were members of. And when my father was growing up, they discovered a young black boy hiding in their dairy barn. He was in bad shape. He had hidden and gotten away when his family was murdered by the Klan over a dispute about land. They were arguing with a white sharecropper about who owned certain land, and the solution was just to burn them out and run them off, and ultimately killed all of the family members except for Alex, who hid. He got away. He came and hid at my grandfather's barn. They discovered him there. My grandfather was a couple generations separated from the Civil War, and he had no particular sentiment for black people. They were just chattel to him. But he offered Alex the choice. Alex was only 7 or 8 years old. And he said, you can get off my land, and I don't care where you go, or if you want to, you can stay here and work on the dairy farm. This was the middle of the Great Depression in the 1930s, or really early in the Great Depression, and they were trying to stay alive as a business.
Sure.
They just saw Alex as another farm worker. They weren't going to pay him anything. They'd feed him and give him a place to sleep. And Alex decided he'd stay. Nice. He really didn't have any choices.
Sure.
And he and my father were the same age. And to really everybody else in the family, he was just another farm worker. But he and my father grew up together, and my father considered him his brother. And it was a large family. There were a lot of other brothers and sisters, but they were very close. And my father talked about Alex a lot. Some of the few stories that I have about my father's growing up were stories that involved him and Alex. And then my father really had a falling out with his father over a lot of things. I don't know which was the most important, but there were a number of different things they had a falling out over. And as soon as World War II started, as soon as they graduated high school, he and Alex left together and joined the North Carolina National Guard, which was almost immediately federalized and called up to service, becoming the Old Hickory 30th U.S. Army Division. In reality, my father and Alex were separated after they enlisted because the Army, while they took black volunteers and they drafted black people, the Army was as segregated as everything else in society. So my father never saw Alex again And really, they never had any information what became of Alex. We think we might have a little bit of information about that now. But my father never knew what became of Alex. Alex didn't come back from the war. So that was my family background. And I was always, being a kind of a growing up in the 60s myself, I was, going through the civil rights era.
Sure.
I was always fascinated by that story of how they had, first of all, how they had a black boy come to be on the farm and be kind of adopted into the family in a very tenuous way. And then the relationship my father had with Alex. So that was the basis of the story. As the story goes on, I do include a lot of some actual history of the battles that my father was involved in, and then I novelistically bring Alex back into the story. But again, that's a fictional element because he never showed up again in reality.
When you talk to your father about Alex, how it had to be devastating for him to, like, I mean, that's like, for all intents and purposes, that was his brother, and to never hear from him again. I mean, did he ever go to the Army and say, hey, this is, Alex? Did Alex take your guys' name, or did he have his own last name, or how did that work?
He had his own last name. His last name was Alex Broadnax.
Okay.
And my dad did talk about him some, and I knew it was very difficult for my dad, having lost him. My father just assumed he was killed in the war.
Right.
Whether or not my dad had the ability to get into to search Army archives, I don't know how much effort he ever put into trying to find out what became of Alex.
Yeah.
But from him talking about Alex, and again, he didn't talk about his family very much. He and his father became estranged. We rarely visited North Carolina. So he didn't talk about his family very much. He didn't talk about the war very much, as I'm sure you know, is typical of a lot of World War II and other war veterans. But when he talked about Alex, you could tell he would talk about, my father he always had a garden, big garden. I'm sure that came from growing up with a garden.
Sure.
But he'd talk about how he and Alex would like to, compete in the garden, who could pick the most snap beans, who could find the biggest potato, things like that.
Right.
You could tell there was an affection there.
Yeah.
As we've tried to see what we can find, we could find Alex's and my dad's enlistment into the Army, but nothing else. And there was apparently a huge fire in the early 70s at a military archive in St. Louis that destroyed a large percentage of World War II military records. So it's not an unusual, it's an experience that many other people I've seen online who have not been able to find out records about what became of people. And a lot of it is attributed to this fire in St. Louis.
Yeah.
We have online found that there are still Broadnaxes who live in the area around Leakesville, North Carolina. And I reached out to them through social media a couple times, but I've never heard back. And we found a death certificate of an Alex Broadnax, who was just listed as being from North Carolina, who died in like the mid-50s in Washington, D.C., working at the U.S. Mint, but really couldn't, and it might be the same Alex Broadnax, but we haven't been able to confirm that.
I mean, it's not a totally common name, so it could be the possibility that he made it out, but it's also like, why didn't he get back with your dad? Or was he maybe just like, went on his own? Back then, it was so different. I retired from the military, so for us, it was very tight record keeping, but back then, I mean, it was all paper stuff. And like you said, I mean, if people have fires, stuff gets destroyed, stuff gets lost. I mean, it's really challenging to keep track of all those guys.
Yeah. What you just touched on there, which becomes important in the book, is if Alex survived the war, which I think he did, but I don't know for sure. Why did he never reach back out to my dad or to the family? I took that question and it becomes an element of the story.
Okay.
In that after World War II, in the story, Alex kind of goes his separate way in an effort to find his own identity. And it's only under unusual circumstances that he and Pete, who's the white brother, my father, become reunited in the late '60s at Fort Jackson.
Oh, okay. Speaking of that, since we're talking about it, do you want to kind of go into the story a little deeper, or maybe give a couple of highlights of the actual story and what happened?
In a rough, wasn't written that way, but in kind of a rough way, the first third of the book are Alex and Pete growing up together in rural North Carolina in a small town that's got a color line that goes right through it. And it addresses some issues that have to do with the racial intolerance and overt racism that existed at the time. Alex and Pete go to different schools. Alex at one point becomes abducted because he hugs his white sister on the street. A lot of very difficult and upsetting circumstances that kind of challenge Alex and Pete as they're growing up together, both external to their family and also within their family. Things that happen that lead to the estrangement between Pete and his father. So then, as I said, they go off together and join the war. They become segregated. And back up a little bit, I'll tell you that the book is told in alternating chapters between Pete's, it's the same story of what's happening to them, but one chapter is told from Alex's perspective, the next chapter is told from Pete's perspective, and it doesn't alternate specifically one to one. But that's how the book was constructed. They're living the same life and having the same life experiences, but the perception of them are very different. Because of their skin color. They go off to World War II, and Alex is, as what happened to all black soldiers, is they were put into non-combatant roles. They were ditch diggers and grave registrations and mechanics and loaders and unloaders. And Alex becomes a mechanic and a truck driver. They go through training and eventually go off to war. Pete, on the other hand, becomes a medic and is part of the 120th Regiment of the 30th Army Division. So for the middle third of the book, I really cover the movements of the 30th Division and the battles they fought. Most significantly, and I know your podcast has a lot of military follow it, there's a very, what I think, underappreciated but critical battle called the Battle of Mortain. Mortain was this little town about 20 miles inland. After the Allied armies landed on Normandy, and my father landed on the day after Normandy, the 30th Division, it was a stalemate to some degree for 4 to 6 weeks as the army tried to advance through the hedgerow country of coastal Normandy. And they'd fight for days to gain an acre of yard, right. And it was really unclear whether they were going to make it out. And finally, through massive reinforcement, the U.S. Army was able to break through the German defensive lines in a battle of a town called St. Lo, which is also a pretty well-known battle. So once the Allied forces captured St. Lo, and the 30th Division was involved in that battle, it opened up a corridor that allowed Patton's Third Army to race through with their tanks and start racing across Brittany, which was cutting the German forces in half.
Oh, okay.
And it was a very decisive moment for the military, because they've achieved this breakthrough from the hedgerow country. They're now on open roads, and they're splitting the German forces in half. The 30th Army advanced about 20 miles to this town called Mortain, which was notable for being a confluence of a lot of major highways that were all capable of handling panzers and tanks. And there was right next to the town, there was a tall hill, which the French called Montjoy, but the U.S. Army just called it Hill 314 because that's how the number of meters tall it was.
Right.
But it was a very rocky, steep sloped mount that was a tremendous position for observation. From the top of 314, you could see all the way back to the coast. You could see dozens of miles east, west, south, in every direction. So whoever controlled Hill 314 was in a catbird seat in terms of being able to direct artillery and movement and airplanes, what have you.
Yeah.
And the Germans recognized it. They recognized the problem that they had with the American breakout. So they ordered a counterattack, which was called Operation Lubitsch. And it was a huge, almost all the German panzers in France, several different infantry divisions, the Luftwaffe, everybody was put into this battle to try to push basically the goal was to recapture Mortain and push the Americans back to the coast. Okay. and cut off Patton's army from its supply route. And then after they did that, then they'd go pick off, the other army divisions and Patton's division kind of one by one. So it was a really key battle that if it had been successful, really would have pushed the Allied invasion back to day one.
Yeah.
And the German goal was to push them off the continent just like they'd done at Dunkirk. And it started on August 5th, I think, at night. The Germans came in really undetected. They swept through Mortain. They captured the town of Mortain, or overran Mortain almost immediately, but they couldn't take Hill 314. And Hill 314 was where my father was in the 120th parts of the 120th Infantry Regiment. They were holding that hill, and they were surrounded. They were cut off, no supplies, and they held that hill for about 5 days and beat back 4 or 5 different German attacks. They certainly had help. One attack was completely destroyed by British Typhoon bombers.
Nice.
Being in the Air Force, it was like, what was the American plane that was great against armor? The Hedgehog?
Yeah, the Warthog, the A-10.
Warthog, yeah. The Typhoons were the British Army equivalent of that. It wasn't a great fighter, but it was a great fighter bomber. So there was one big battle where the Germans were completely decimated by the Typhoons coming in. But, a very heroic stand by the 120th.
Yeah.
They held out. Finally, the Germans retreated, and they had been the Germans had been so decimated by their efforts. I think they lost like 7 of their 9 panzer divisions. They were so decimated by the inability to take Mortain that it allowed the Americans then just to sweep through France. And Paris was captured in like a couple of weeks. And they eventually pushed the Germans all the way back to the German border, which again led just 5 or 6 months later to the Battle of the Bulge, which was the Germans' last effort, to stop the American advance. But there would not have been a Battle of the Bulge if there hadn't been the Battle of Mortain. So a big for your readers who like World War II stories, there's a big portion of the book that has to do with the American defense of Hill 314. And in that battle, Alex and Pete get reunited kind of through serendipity. And Pete and Alex are both heroic in their separate ways. Alex is a fighter, Pete's a medic. And then the story goes on from there. The war's over. Alex has a prolonged recovery from when he is critically injured in that battle. And then he has to recover. The war's over. And Alex has to make a decision what he's going to do with his life. Is he going to go back to the dairy farm, go back to his brother Pete and his white family, or is he going to go his own way and try to establish his identity as a black man, which is what he does. And so their lives diverge a bit toward the end, but ultimately they're reunited when both are assigned to Fort Jackson in the late 60s. By this time, Pete is the medical service corps director of the Army hospital there, and Alex is the head of the MPs. And circumstances bring them back together, kind of a little bit of a crime story there at the end of the book.
Oh, okay.
So it's not probably my rattling on. It sounds like there's a lot going on. It does hang together well in the book, and I think your readers would enjoy the story of how they came together as kids. They would enjoy the war story aspect of it, which is pretty exciting, really.
Yeah.
And then they would enjoy their how they decide to reunite at the end, where they really both have a lot of hesitancies to overcome in reuniting after so many years, particularly Alex, who's afraid he might lose his identity again. He has a family that knows nothing about his childhood growing up as part of a white family. So anyway, that's the story.
So in the book, they fight together, and then they get stationed. They come back. So what happens in between them fighting together and then linking back up for the crime story portion of it?
They both decide to stay in the Army. Pete and I don't. This is not a part of the book that's dwelled upon. Pete, as from early in the book, has a bad relationship with his father for a lot of different reasons. He decides he doesn't want to go back to being a dairy farmer. He stays in the Army, builds himself a career. Alex, who's still a black man in white America in the 40s and 50s and early 60s, he sees the Army as one of the only meritocracies that still exist. And despite its warts and despite its inadequacies, which you know better than I do, I mean, there was still plenty of racism and discrimination in the military that went on forever, and I'm sure probably still exists some today. But Alex saw it as a place where a man could succeed on his own merit. And he had succeeded as in the military. He had been transferred to the military police, and he liked what the military career offered to him. So he stays in the military, and they just don't happen to cross. They choose not to cross paths until they're eventually kind of forced to by circumstances.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, going back to what you were saying, I mean, I think people take for granted, you mentioned racism. I think it's always going to kind of be around. But back then, when everything was segregated, I mean, the military's tough enough to do the things they expect you to do, especially back then when they had, limited technology, and the guys like your father were thought of more as cannon fodder as opposed to soldier. They're like, hey, go take that hill and hold it, and we need that hill no matter how many people die. Think about going through that kind of adversity, but also people are being racist against you. I mean, I can't imagine what those guys went through, having to do everything that the other soldiers had to do, but also take that negativity and just that hate. I don't know how they did it. I mean, it's kind of a testament to guys like Alex who endured, and were able to overcome all that adversity and still be successful.
I wanted to try to. I find that equally amazing, and I wanted to try to bring that out a little bit in the book as well.
Yeah.
There were no secrets. I mean, black soldiers knew they were getting a shitty end of the deal.
Right.
But there also was a belief at the time that this war and being allowed, the integration of the Army to the degree it was believed that was an opportunity for black Americans to show their worth, to show their value, to create some foxhole fraternity. Right. That would translate back, once the war was over. And there was a lot of discussion about that, mm-hmm. and both in the Army and outside the Army.
Right.
And that was one of the forces in the Army that were in favor of keeping segregation going in the Army, that was their fear. They were afraid that the Army would prove that blacks and whites could work and live together without resulting in chaos and anarchy.
Right.
And I think to some degree the military did prove that.
Oh, 100%.
And there were, at the time, and maybe even still today, there are people who just don't want that. They don't believe that that's possible, and they don't want any evidence that it is possible.
Yeah. I know when I was in, like I said before, there's always going to be some underlying racism somewhere, but I think it's getting exponentially better as we go. The zero tolerance issue keeps everything on an even playing field. At the end of the day, to your point, the military is a place where anybody can get in there and excel if they put their mind to it. It's like you said, it's a meritocracy. It's a place where good, hard work is rewarded.
When I grew up went to junior high school and high school in the late 60s through the early 70s. In our school district, we had the high school that served Fort Jackson.
Okay.
So I had never gone to anything other than integrated schools. Growing up on base or off base, I always went to integrated schools.
Right.
And in 1970, South Carolina was forced to integrate by the federal government, Department of Justice. I don't know what money, I'm sure, was the leverage, but they forced South Carolina to finally integrate. And they instituted busing, and busing was always a flashpoint, and that happened everywhere except in our school district, because our school district had always been an integrated school district. Anyway, at one point in the book, Alex is talking to his son. They're having a conversation about race, and his son wants to know why his father's working for the man, so to speak.
Right.
And Alex explains to him that the military is the only, this is at the time, said the military is the only place in America where white men worked under a black man. And I that in the 1950s and 60s, that's probably was true.
Yeah. I mean, the military has led the way in a lot of those things. And it just boils down to the mission of the military and protecting the United States and whatever it takes to do that. And frankly, segregation is not conducive to a harmonious unit. It's not conducive to protecting the United States. So I think at the end of the day, I don't know how altruistic the leaders were at the time, but they knew that it didn't make sense. It wasn't a good idea. And I think underlying, because the military always has to have some specific reason on why they do things. But I think underlying it was like, it's just not right. It's just not right to treat these people different than these other people.
As I said earlier, my father didn't talk about the war very much, but I remember one thing I always remember him talking about. I don't know what spurred the conversation, but I asked him, why did they fight in the context of some question, and he said, we didn't give a damn about the American flag. We didn't give a damn about Germans or Nazis. We didn't have any political agenda. He said, the only thing you ever fought for was the person in the foxhole next to you.
That's right.
You kept each other alive. And that was your duty to him and his duty to you. And we were all filthy. You couldn't, it didn't matter if the person in the foxhole next to you was white or black.
Right.
They were helping to keep you alive, and you were trying to keep them alive. So that's the term I don't, it's not in the book, but the term I saw in some of the things I read was foxhole fraternity.
Yeah.
And my father experienced that.
It's true. It really is true. I mean, once it all kind of all that stuff goes away once you're out in combat.
No room for that kind of thinking.
It's dangerous.
And it'll probably get you killed.
That's right. 100%. Where can we find this book? I think I saw it on Amazon. Is that the best place to go, or should we go to your website, or where's the best place to get this book?
The best place is always Amazon. It's available on Barnes & Noble, Kindle, Books A Million. It's available on all the websites.
Okay.
And if you go to my author website, which is rogerbnewman.com, there's links. There's background information about all my books and about boys.
Okay.
So that's the place to go. And if you enjoy it, Amazon's still the big elephant in the room. put in a good word for me with an Amazon review and tell your
Definitely.
family and friends.
Yeah, I'll also post all those links in my social media whenever I advertise for this episode.
I really appreciate it.
Yes, sir. No, I mean, like I said, when I started reading it, that initial, and it was a perfect, kind of a grab. You talked about how the first thing I read was how Alex was part of your dad's family, and I was like, what? That's amazing. I mean, it's a cool kind of a beginning to the whole story.
Yeah, the probably, like I said earlier, there were a number of flashpoints between my father and my grandfather, who was a primitive Baptist preacher. That's a whole nother story, the primitive Baptist.
Right.
But my father could never understand the hypocrisy of spreading the word of God, yet Alex was never allowed to go to church with the family.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's some good scenes in the book where my father tries to argue religion with Papa, who's the grandfather.
Yeah.
And he, of course, has an encyclopedic knowledge of the scriptures and can argue everything. And Pete just ends up getting frustrated that he knows he's right, but he can't argue it.
Right. Yeah, they never made much sense to me. They claim they're Christian, but then they act that way towards their fellow man. I don't know. It seems odd.
And Pete carries that over into the latter parts of the book, where he's still struggling with kind of the concept of religious teachings that he received as a child and war. As a medic, he went to whoever was injured. Sometimes he'd be treating German wounded.
Right.
And he was, they were asking the same God for the same help with the same assurance that they were in the right as the American soldiers were.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes you think. It's not as cut and dry as in the movies. It's very
No, there's not always necessarily clear-cut good guys and bad guys.
right. Well, sir, again, thank you very much for coming on. I'll put this out pretty soon. And
as I said earlier, I know your listening audience is a lot of military stuff, and there is a big component of this book that would be, I think, really interesting to people with military backgrounds. But the book's really a family saga about the challenges these two brothers encountered based on the different colors of their skin, and how they, as you said earlier, their resilience as they have to deal with these things and kind of come out on the other side successfully, despite really a lot of challenges they face. And then I didn't really talk too much about it. The last part of the book's a pretty good whodunit crime story for people who like mysteries, where basically Pete's the victim of a severe beating, and Alex, is the head of the military police, is assigned to figure out who did it.
okay.
And it brings them into I'm sure you've probably experienced this. It brings him into conflict with the civilian police.
Yeah.
And the kind of the battle between civilian police authority and military police authority as to who he has to negotiate the local civilian police chief, who, of course, unfortunately is a racist as well.
Sure. Well, you said it was set in the 60s, right?
Yeah, late 60s.
So you have a black military policeman who's probably high ranking, dealing with a racist, local cop. I'm sure the sparks fly.
In Columbia, South Carolina, in 1969. So
Yeah.
there's, so I think there's a lot of different elements of the story besides the military. Although the military element, I really liked writing, and people that have read it have enjoyed the story and had lots of questions about the Battle of Mortain and things like that. One of the really interesting things that I found interesting, you might be familiar with this, is in the Battle of Mortain, as they were again cut off. They ran out of ammunition, they ran out of food, they ran out of supplies, medical supplies. But one of the key things they ran out of were batteries for the radio. And they without the radio batteries, they would die.
Yeah.
Without radio batteries, they were stuck. So what the military did, they tried airdrops, but Mortain had a very small summit and winds that were whipping around and steep slopes. So the military airdrops were never very successful. At one point, the U.S. Army started shooting shells onto the top of the hill where the 120th Regiment was, containing supplies. They
Awesome.
took stuff out of the shells. I guess they used the shells that they did with leaflets in,
Okay.
and they would stuff them with supplies like plasma and anything that was in glass. None of that worked, but they were able to shoot shells with radio batteries into the position, and which is what kept them going a little bit, which is just kind of an interesting side story.
For sure. That's amazing.
I don't know if the military tries that under other circumstances or
I've
not.
never heard of it.
They marked them with big red X's so they wouldn't start hammering and digging around live shells.
Oh,
Important
that's
safety tip.
yeah, right. Yeah, you don't want to dig
So
around the wrong one.
anyway, I think people will like the story. I appreciate the opportunity you've given me to come on and talk about it.
Well, the pleasure is all mine. I can't thank you enough for coming on. I really do appreciate it.
All right. Well, thanks very much.
All right, sir. It's great meeting you.
Nice meeting you too, and all your folks. Take care.